this next video, this is on 2 Corinthians, and we want to begin by looking at this. This is I think probably one of Paul's neglected letters, although it's also one of Paul's chief letters. It's really about bringing people back together. Now, as far as the authorship goes, obviously, if we're talking about this being Paul's letter, the authorship is pretty much undisputed. But what the question is did Paul write all of it? Is it maybe a couple letters that are put together? Maybe it's some fragments of stuff and then kind of pushed it together. And then we just call it 2 Corinthians. There are some arguments that have been made really starting around 1776, and that some regarding the first 9 chapters and then the last 4 chapters, chapters 10 through 13, as really an insert because there's a change in tone. And there's also seems to be the idea of that maybe this was supposed to be a sorrowful letter. And then there's some disagreement between what is said in chapters 1 through 9 versus what is said in chapters 10 through 13. And some believe that at the end, Paul seems to be self-boasting. I would say, though, there's really no manuscript evidence that leads to that, that shows any kind of piecing together of the letters. There's also no mention of the offense in chapters 10 through 13 that would to give way to a sorrowful letter. The bearer of the sorrowful letter, who is Titus, had returned to Paul, and so chapters 10 through 13 must have come after Titus's return, and he's writing a letter, Titus returns, and that's when he approaches that. And there's really the swing and mood is really not so great if you consider the length of the letter. Remember, a lot of letters in that day were limited to 90 to 100 words, and 2 Corinthians is way beyond that. And so the swing and mood does not seem to be so great. Now, we talk about the Church of Corinth. This is the same church that 1 Corinthians was written to, also where Paul writes to the Church of Thessalonica. And he's probably writing, at this point, he's writing from Macedonia. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, now when I came to Troas, which is in northwestern modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, for the gospel of Christ, when the door was opened for me to the Lord, and I had no rest for my spirit, not finding Titus my brother, but taking my leave of them, I went on to Macedonia. And so most likely he is writing from the city of Macedonia. Remember, 1 Corinthians, he writes from Ephesus. Now, I don't know how many of you might remember a show back in the 80s called The A-Team. And there was a guy that played on there called Mr. T. And he was a big guy, wore a lot of chains. And Mr. T of the New Testament is Timothy. Timothy delivers 1 Corinthians to the church, and really the situation got worse. And so the church is filled with false apostles, people trying to make false recommendations. And Paul hears and makes a painful visit, as he describes in 2 Corinthians. And Paul considered it a complete fiasco, and Paul leaves for Ephesus, maybe to kind of heal some wounds. And so Paul had sent them a severe letter. Now, let me pause here for a second and kind of back up a few things to our look at 1 Corinthians. Remember, 1 Corinthians Paul talks to them about a previous letter, and so which we don't have. And so Paul writes to them a previous letter, which we don't have. We do have 1 Corinthians. Evidently, Paul had written to them a severe letter, which we don't have. And then we have 2 Corinthians. So in total, this is probably the fourth letter that Paul wrote to the church of Corinth, two of which remain, which we have as 1 and 2 Corinthians. And then the letter laid down what Paul expected and demanded for those who were false teachers. And the letter was sent with a rather forceful Titus, in this case, the other Mr. T. And so Titus got some things straightened out. Paul was having some trouble in Ephesus. He left to go to Troas. He planned to come down. And so he gets a report that the Corinthian church had turned around, and then Paul sends them 2 Corinthians. Now, if we follow that through, then this would place 2 Corinthians around 55, 56 AD, and in doing so would come obviously after 1 Corinthians, but would place it then in the order of Paul's travel as he's traveling around on his third missionary journey, which we'll get to. I want to give some comparisons in the few minutes here of this lecture video to talk a little bit about the difference between 1 and 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is really practical. He gives some advice. 2 Corinthians is more personal. 1 Corinthians is systematic. There's an approach to it. 2 Corinthians is really sentimental. He's just talking about what's going on. In 1 Corinthians, there's a lot of pagan influence. In 2 Corinthians, there's a lot of Judaism that is influencing the church away from its teachings. Paul sharing his mind about situations. 2 Corinthians, Paul sharing his heart. He's telling them, he's laying it out there for them. 1 Corinthians is the character of the church, and in 2 Corinthians, Paul is addressing the character of Paul that had come in under attack. Now, the next two slides, and in your notes, you have an outline, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through. I'm just going to put it up for you. It's also in your notes. And really, from the outline, there's not a whole lot that you need to know, other than it's just kind of a breakdown of maybe how 2 Corinthians would look and understanding. What I do want to show you, again, is we would come to chapter 10, and that's where some people think that that's maybe a different letter that's added in. I don't think that is. It's just a change in the way that Paul is writing to them. And so here are the key facts. We have the date. This would come, which has been left out of the slide. So let me put this up here for you. Let me get my pen. This would be Acts 20. There's my dot. Verse 1. For some reason that got left out in the slide. And so he's writing to Corinth, but he's writing from Macedonia about the jubilation in Christ. And then the key verses, one that we read earlier, which is 2 Corinthians chapter 2 in verse 14. Remember to make sure that you're filling in your chart. And remember, you'll need that help for your second exam. Also to kind of see all the information about Paul's letters at one time. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to email me. Make sure that you're keeping up with your project and your work. Do not get behind at this point in the semester. Have a great day.